If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The Saturday afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of the Four Seasons, one of New York City's most sophisticated restaurants, casting golden beams across the tables, covered in white linen cloths. Helen Montgomery, at 73, maintained her usual elegant posture, a pearl necklace resting delicately on the navy blue dress she had chosen for the luncheon. Her white hair was styled in a flawless bun, and the emerald ring on her right ring finger caught the light with every movement of her hand. Seated across from her, Michael, her 45-year-old son, discreetly scrolled through his phone while commenting on the latest figures from the family's construction company. Helen listened with moderate attention, savoring the mushroom risotto she had ordered. These Saturday lunches had become a tradition in recent years, an attempt to keep alive the family routine that had once been so present and had gradually unraveled amidst commitments, business trips, and absences that no one dared to name. The conversation was flowing naturally when Helen noticed an unusual movement near the entrance of the dining room. One of the waiters was gesturing discreetly to the security guard, and both were looking towards the revolving door. It was then that she saw her, a small girl, no more than 12 years old, too thin for her age, with dirty clothes and disheveled hair, had managed to get past the reception and was walking between the tables with wide eyes. The contrast was stark. While the restaurant's patrons wore designer clothes and spoke in low tones about international travel and investments, this child seemed to have stepped out of another world. Her bare feet left, small prints on the polished floor, and she clutched something to her chest, hidden under her torn blouse. Michael stopped mid-sentence as he noticed the commotion. He turned and frowned. "Mom, what's going on?" he questioned, already signaling to the private security guard who always accompanied them on public outings. Helen didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the girl, who was now approaching their table with hesitant steps. There was something in that childish gaze that touched her in an inexplicable way. It wasn't just the misery etched on the dirty face, but an almost desperate determination that shone through the fear. "Please," the girl's voice came out trembling, almost a whisper. "Please, I need food. My mother is sick, and I haven't eaten anything since yesterday." The security guard was already beside the table, ready to intervene. Michael made a discreet gesture with his hand, authorizing the child's removal, but before any move was made, the girl pointed to Helen's hand. "That ring," she said, her voice gaining a thread of urgency. "My mother has a ring just like it." The silence that fell was absolute. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. Slowly she lowered her eyes to the emerald ring she had worn for decades, the jewel her late husband, Robert, had custom-made to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary. There were only 3 such rings in the world. One was on her finger. Another had been buried with Robert as per his final wish, and the third had disappeared 13 years ago, along with her daughter, Beatrice. Helen's heart raced. She raised her eyes to the girl, studying every feature of that dirty, frightened face. There was something familiar there, something she couldn't name, but that resonated somewhere deep in her memory. "What is your mother's name?" Helen asked, her voice coming out firmer than she expected. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting from Helen to the approaching security guard. She took half a step back, ready to flee. "Wait!" Helen raised her hand, stopping the guard. "No one is going to hurt you. Tell me, what is your mother's name?" The girl swallowed hard. "She told me never to tell her real name. But she has the ring. I've seen it. It's just like yours." Michael intervened, his voice heavy with impatience. "Mum, this is absurd. That ring could be anything, probably a cheap imitation someone is using to run a scam. Let's let security handle this." But Helen wasn't listening. All the rationality that normally guided her decisions had been momentarily suspended by something greater, a maternal intuition she thought she had buried along with the hope of ever seeing her daughter again. She reached out her hand to the girl. "Can you prove this?" Helen asked, keeping her voice calm. "Do you have a picture of her? Something you can show me?" The girl looked around, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Slowly she reached inside her dirty blouse and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded several times and protected by a makeshift clear plastic sleeve. With trembling fingers, she handed it to Helen. Helen's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. It was an old photograph, faded by time and moisture, with creased edges. But the image was clear enough. A woman of about 40, thin, with dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail, looked directly at the camera. The eyes were unmistakable. Those deep brown eyes, with tiny flecks of gold near the pupil, were the same ones Helen saw in the mirror every day. They were the Montgomery family eyes. They were Beatrice's eyes. The restaurant seemed to spin around Helen. She gripped the edge of the table, her breath catching. "Mom!" Michael stood up in alarm, holding her arm. "Mom, what is it? What's in that photo?" Helen couldn't speak. Tears began to stream down her face, smudging the makeup she had so carefully applied that morning. She looked at the girl, truly looked for the first time, and began to see past the dirt and rags, the shape of the face, the curve of the nose, the way she tilted her head slightly to the side when she was scared. "My God," Helen whispered. "Beatrice." Michael took the photo from his mother's trembling hands. His expression changed instantly from irritation to shock. He too recognized his older sister, the one who had disappeared without a trace, taking a piece of the family's soul with her. "Where is she?" Helen grabbed the girl's hands with a strength surprising for someone her age. "Where is your mother? Take me to her, now." The girl, frightened by the intensity of the reaction, pulled back, but Helen didn't let go. "Please." Helen softened her voice, tears still streaming. "Please, darling, this woman in the photo might be my daughter. She disappeared a long time ago. I need to see her. Please take me to her." The girl looked at the elegant lady, crying, without a care for the people around them who were beginning to watch the scene. There was something genuine in that pain, something she recognized because she carried her own pains as well. "She's sick," the girl said, her voice breaking. "It's been 3 weeks since she disappeared. She leaves the house and doesn't come back. I came here because I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted food, but when I saw your ring, I remembered my mum always said that if I ever needed real help, I should look for someone with a ring like hers." Helen felt her heart clench. She looked at Michael, who was still holding the photo, his face pale. They exchanged a look heavy with years of unresolved pain, of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights, wondering what had happened to Beatrice. "Let's go," Helen said, rising from her chair with a determination that surprised even herself. "You will take us to your mother now." Michael hesitated. "Mom, we don't know if this is real. It could be dangerous. We need to think calmly." "Think calmly?" Helen turned to her son, her eyes shining with a mix of pain and hope. "I have spent 13 years thinking calmly, Michael. 13 years wondering if your sister was alive or dead. 13 years blaming myself for not realizing something was wrong before she disappeared. If there is a chance, just one chance, that this child is telling the truth, I will not waste it by thinking calmly." The silence that followed was heavy. Michael knew that look. It was the same look his mother had when she made important business decisions, when there was no room for doubt or hesitation. He sighed and nodded to the security guard. "Get the car ready," he said, "and call for 2 more security men. We don't know where we're going." Helen grabbed her purse, left enough money on the table to cover the bill and a generous tip, and extended her hand to the girl. "What's your name, dear?" she asked, her voice softer now. The girl looked at the outstretched hand and after a moment's hesitation took it. "Julia," she replied. "My name is Julia." "Julia," Helen repeated, savoring the name. "Very well, Julia. Now you will take us to your mother, and I promise that, whatever happens, I will make sure you have the food you need." The car ride was long and revealing. Julia sat in the back seat next to Helen, still wary, but gradually beginning to relax. In broken sentences, she told them about the life she led. She lived with her mother in a small apartment in the Bronx, a borough Helen knew only by name but had never visited. Her mother worked as a cleaner in houses and offices, but in recent months she had fallen ill. Julia didn't know exactly what it was, only that her mother coughed a lot and grew weaker each day. She started leaving the house, Julia explained, her eyes fixed on her dirty hands. Sometimes she's out all night. When she comes back, she smells of alcohol and doesn't talk to me. I tried to ask the neighbors for help, but everyone has their own problems, so I thought I'd come to downtown Manhattan, where the rich people are, to ask for help. Helen listened in silence, her heart aching. If that woman was indeed Beatrice, what had happened to reduce her to this state? Where had she been all these years? Why had she never made contact? The car entered increasingly narrow streets, with old buildings and worn facades. The difference between this neighborhood and Helen's world was abysmal. Children played on the sidewalk, women chatted in doorways, and groups of men played dominoes at makeshift tables. It was a parallel world, vibrant and chaotic, so different from the gated communities and tree-lined streets of the Upper East Side where Helen lived. "It's there," Julia pointed to, a 5-story building with peeling paint and rusted window bars. "Third floor." The security guard parked the car and was the first to get out, checking the surroundings. Michael helped Helen out, and the three of them followed Julia into the building. The hallway was dark and smelled of mold. The concrete staircase had steps worn down by time, and the light from the bulbs was dim and yellow. Helen climbed the steps slowly, her heart beating faster and faster. Each step brought her closer to a truth she had sought for so long but that now filled her with fear. What if it wasn't Beatrice? What if it was, but she didn't want to be found? What if this was all just another cruel disappointment? Julia stopped in front of a wooden door, number 13, and knocked 3 times. "Mom," she called out. "Mom, it's me. I brought help." There was no answer. Julia tried the doorknob and the door creaked open. The apartment was dimly lit, with the curtains drawn. The smell was strong, a mixture of dampness, old food, and something else Helen couldn't identify. "Mom," Julia entered, followed by Helen and Michael. The security guards remained. Outside, standing guard. The living room was small, with old worn furniture. An old television occupied one corner, and clothes were scattered on the sofa. Julia went down a narrow hallway to a bedroom in the back. Helen followed, holding her breath. The bedroom was even smaller, with a single bed against the wall and a dark wood wardrobe. And there, lying on the bed, was a woman. Helen stopped at the doorway, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. The woman was facing away, curled up under a thin sheet. Her dark hair was tangled and dirty, spread across the pillow. She was thin, dangerously thin, her bones visible even under her clothes. "Mum," Julia approached the bed and touched the woman's shoulder. "Mum, wake up. I brought help." The woman stirred slightly and mumbled something incomprehensible. Julia insisted, shaking her more firmly. Slowly the woman turned over, and Helen felt the world stop. They were Beatrice's eyes, deeper, more tired, surrounded by dark circles and marks of suffering, but they were her eyes. The face was thinner, aged beyond its years, with wrinkles that shouldn't have been there. But it was her. It was her daughter. "Beatrice," Helen whispered, the tears returning. The woman blinked, confused, trying to focus. Her eyes scanned Helen's face, and something in them changed. Recognition dawned slowly, as if emerging from a very deep and forgotten place. "Mom," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. And then, before Helen could move or say anything, Beatrice closed her eyes and fainted. What followed was a whirlwind. Michael immediately called for an ambulance, and within minutes, paramedics were in the apartment, checking Beatrice's vital signs. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and feverish. She was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital, the best in New York, where Helen ensured she would receive all necessary care. Julia watched everything in silence, clinging to Helen's hand. The old woman hadn't let go of her since they entered the room, and even now, in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, she kept the girl by her side. At the hospital, while Beatrice was being examined by doctors, Helen and Michael waited in the VIP lounge. Julia had been taken for a bath and given clean clothes, and now she slept in an armchair next to Helen, exhausted by the day's tension. Michael paced back and forth, his hands in his pockets. "I can't believe she's alive," he said for the 10th time. "After all these years, I was sure I'd never see her again." Helen didn't reply. She was looking at Julia, at the girl's peaceful face as she slept. This was the granddaughter she never knew she had, Beatrice's daughter. So many unanswered questions swirled in her head that she didn't know where to begin. The door opened, and a doctor entered, consulting a clipboard. "Mrs. Montgomery," he greeted her. "Your daughter is stable now. She was severely dehydrated and malnourished and also shows signs of substance abuse. We'll keep her under observation, but the prognosis is good. She will recover." Helen closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer of thanks. "May I see her?" she asked. "You may, but she's still sedated. It will be a few hours before she wakes up." "That's fine," Helen stood up. "I'll stay with her." And so that night, as the city of New York continued its frantic life outside, Helen Montgomery sat by the hospital bed where her long-lost daughter finally rested in safety. She held Beatrice's hand, feeling the weak but steady pulse, and allowed herself, for the first time in 13 years, to hope that her family could somehow be rebuilt. The morning light filtered through the hospital room window, softly illuminating Beatrice's face. Helen had spent the entire night there, sitting in the armchair beside the bed, watching her daughter sleep. Every breath, every movement was a miracle she never thought she would witness again. Michael had gone home to get clean clothes and handle some urgent matters, but promised to return soon. Julia was still asleep on the smaller sofa, wrapped in a blanket a kind nurse had brought. When Beatrice finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was her mother's face. For a moment she seemed confused, as if she couldn't tell if she was dreaming or if this was real. Then the tears began to fall, silent and heavy. "Mom?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely audible. "You're really here?" Helen immediately stood up and held her daughter's hand gently, as if afraid she might disappear again if she squeezed too hard. "I'm here, my daughter," Helen said, her own voice choked with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Beatrice closed her eyes, fresh tears streaming down her temples. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." Helen wanted to ask 1,000 questions. She wanted to understand what had happened, why Beatrice had disappeared, where she had been all these years. But looking at her daughter in such a fragile state, she decided the answers could wait. What mattered right now was that she was alive. "You don't have to talk now." Helen stroked Beatrice's tangled hair. "You need to recover first. We'll talk about everything later." But Beatrice shook her head, opening her eyes again. "No, Mom, I need to talk. I need to explain. You deserve to know the truth after all this time." Just then Julia stirred on the sofa, waking up. She blinked a few times, disoriented, until her eyes met her mother's. In a second, she was on her feet, running to the bed. "Mom, you're awake." Julia held Beatrice's other hand, her eyes shining with relief. Beatrice smiled weakly at her daughter and pulled her closer, kissing her forehead. "I'm okay, my love. Thanks to you." Helen watched the interaction between them, her heart tight. This brave little girl had saved not only her own mother, but had also returned a daughter to her. It was impossible not to feel a profound gratitude for Julia. A doctor came in to do the morning assessment, and after checking Beatrice's vital signs and adjusting some medications, he gave the good news that she was recovering well. He recommended a few days of hospitalization to ensure the dehydration was fully treated and she regained her strength. When they were alone again, Beatrice asked Julia to go have breakfast with one of the nurses. The girl hesitated, but her mother insisted gently and she eventually agreed. As soon as the door closed, Beatrice turned to Helen. "Mom, I need to tell you everything from the beginning," she started, her voice still weak but determined. "And I need you to listen to the end, even if it's hard." Helen pulled the chair closer and sat down, preparing herself to hear the truth she had waited 13 long years for. Beatrice took a deep breath before she began. "You remember that last year before I disappeared? I was working at the company with Dad, handling new investments." Helen nodded. She remembered well. Beatrice had always been the most dedicated to the family business, even more so than Michael. Robert had been immensely proud of her. "I started noticing some irregularities in the contracts," Beatrice continued. "Figures that didn't add up, companies that didn't exist, money being diverted to strange accounts. At first I thought it was a mistake, but the more I investigated, the more I realized it was intentional. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. Go on. I took my findings to Dad, Beatrice said, her voice trembling. He was furious, but not with me. He said he already suspected some things but had no concrete proof. Together we started gathering evidence, and we discovered that one of his partners, Oliver Crawford, was involved in very dangerous business. Oliver Crawford. Helen remembered him well, an influential businessman who had been a minority partner in the construction company for years. He had passed away a few years after Beatrice's disappearance, under circumstances she never fully understood. Oliver was using the company to launder money from dubious sources, Beatrice explained. When Dad confronted him, he denied everything. But a few days later, I started receiving threats, phone calls in the middle of the night, cars following me, messages saying that if I didn't stop investigating, my family would suffer the consequences. My God, Beatrice, Helen clutched her chest. Why didn't you tell us? I told Dad, Beatrice said, tears welling up again. He was desperate. He said he would handle it, that he would protect me. But the threats only got worse, and then one night I got a call. The voice on the other end said that if I didn't disappear, if I didn't vanish completely and never come back, they would do something terrible to you, Mom. And to Michael. Helen felt tears stream down her own face. Beatrice, no. I had no choice, Beatrice sobbed. Dad arranged everything for me. He gave me money, fake documents, and the ring. He said the ring was so I would remember I was always part of the family, even from afar. And he made me promise I would never make contact, never give any sign of life until he was sure the danger was gone. So Robert knew, Helen whispered, the revelation hurting like an open wound. Your father knew where you were the whole time. He knew I was alive, Beatrice corrected. But he didn't know exactly where. I moved from city to city, every few months, always afraid of being found. I used false names, worked different jobs, and then 2 years after I disappeared, Dad passed away. Robert's death had been devastating for Helen. A sudden heart attack, the doctors said. He had been working late at home when it happened. Helen had always blamed herself for not noticing the signs, for not insisting he rest more. When I heard he was gone, Beatrice continued, I was completely lost. The only person who knew the truth was gone. I thought about coming back, about telling you and Michael everything, but I was so afraid the threats were still real. And the more time passed, the harder it became to imagine how I could explain it all. Helen held her daughter's hands tighter. And Julia, she asked gently, how did she come into your life? Beatrice smiled faintly through her tears. 5 years after I disappeared, I was living in Philadelphia, working as a clerk in a pharmacy. I met a man, Richard. He was kind, hard-working, and didn't ask too many questions about my past. We fell in love, and Julia was born a year later. And her father? Where is he? Now? He left us when Julia was 3, Beatrice said, sadness evident in her voice. He said he couldn't live with someone who had so many secrets, who was never completely honest with him. And he was right. I could never tell him the whole truth, not even him. After he left, things got harder and harder. Beatrice explained how she had moved to New York City 5 years ago, thinking it would be easier to hide and start over in a big city. But life had been tougher than she imagined. Jobs were unstable, money was always tight, and then, a few months ago, she had started to feel completely hopeless. I started drinking, Beatrice admitted, the shame clear on her face. At first it was just to help me sleep, to forget a little of everything I'd lost. But it got worse. I would leave the house and wander the streets for hours, going into cheap bars, trying to escape reality. And Julia was at home alone, waiting. The guilt in Beatrice's voice was palpable. Helen wanted to judge her, wanted to be furious for all the wrong choices, for all the lost years. But looking at her daughter, so fragile and broken in that hospital bed, all she could feel was compassion. You did what you thought you had to do to protect us, Helen said finally. It was an impossible choice, and you were alone. But you're not alone anymore. Now I'm here. At that moment, the door opened and Michael walked in, carrying a bag of clothes. He stopped when he saw them both crying and approached slowly. B, he said, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. It's good to have you back. Beatrice looked at her younger brother, who was now a grown man, so different from the young man she had left behind. Michael, I'm so sorry for everything. He came closer and, to both their surprise, wrapped Beatrice in a careful hug, mindful not to pull on the IV lines. We'll talk about it later, he said. Right now, the important thing is for you to get well. Julia returned then, carrying a tray with fruit and juice. She paused at the door upon seeing the three of them together, and something in her expression softened. For the first time since this all began, she seemed to believe that things might actually get better. The following days in the hospital were a time of physical and emotional recovery. Beatrice gradually gained weight, colour returned to her face, and strength returned to her limbs. But it was the long conversations with Helen and Michael that truly began to heal her from the inside. They talked about Robert, about how the company had thrived after his death, about the years Helen had spent alone in the large Upper East Side house. It was during one of these conversations that Helen made the proposal that would change everything. Beatrice, you and Julia are going to live with me, she said firmly. The house is too big for one person and you both need a safe place to start over. Beatrice hesitated. Mom, I don't know if that's a good idea. After everything that's happened, after all the years I was away. Helen cut her off with a wave of her hand. I know it will be difficult. I know we have a lot to rebuild, but I want my family close to me. I've lost too much time already. Beatrice looked at Julia, who was sitting beside her on the bed, her eyes hopeful. The girl said nothing, but her wish was obvious. There's one condition, Beatrice said finally, lifting her chin with a determination that recalled the strong woman she used to be. If we're going to do this, it has to be with absolute honesty. No secrets, no lies, and the family has to come first, always. That's what separated us before, Mom. The work, the business, everything always came before family. Helen felt the words like a blow, but knew they were true. She and Robert had built an empire, but in the process, they had neglected what truly mattered. You're right, Helen said, and I promise it will be different this time. Michael, who was present for this conversation, also agreed. I'll step back more from the business, he said. Hire trustworthy people to take on more responsibilities. I want to be a present uncle for Julia. I want to really get to know my niece. Julia smiled, and it was the first time Helen had seen a genuine smile on the girl's face. When Beatrice was discharged from the hospital a week later, she went straight to the Montgomery mansion on the Upper East Side. The three-story house with its immense gardens and swimming pool seemed like a completely different world from everything Julia had ever known. The girl walked through the corridors with wide eyes, delicately touching the fine furniture, the silk curtains, the paintings on the walls. Helen had prepared 2 bedrooms on the second floor, one for Beatrice and one for Julia, both overlooking the garden. She had also hired a team of professionals to help: a cook, 2 housekeepers, a gardener, and most importantly, a psychologist specializing in family trauma. The first few months were challenging. Beatrice faced the effects of withdrawal, the demons of the past waking her in the middle of the night. Helen was always there, sitting with her through the difficult pre-dawn hours, holding her hand through the tremors and tears. Michael visited almost every day, bringing gifts for Julia and funny stories to lighten the mood. Julia, for her part, had to adapt to a completely new life. Helen enrolled her at the Dalton School, one of the best private schools in New York City. At first, the girl felt out of place among classmates who talked about international trips and designer clothes, but she was intelligent and determined, and slowly she found her place. It was Michael who became the closest figure to Julia in those early days. He took her to explore the city on weekends, showing her museums, parks, places she had never seen. He taught her to ride a bike in the mansion's garden, helped her with her math homework, and listened patiently as she told him about her challenges at school. The relationship between Beatrice and Helen was more complex. There was love, that was undeniable, but there was also hurt on both sides. Helen had to deal with the pain of abandonment, even understanding the reasons. Beatrice carried the guilt of all the choices she had made. The family therapy sessions helped, But the real healing came from the small, everyday moments. Like the afternoon, Beatrice came down to the kitchen and found Helen baking the carrot cake she used to make when Beatrice was a child. They worked side by side in silence, each lost in their own memories, until Beatrice said softly, "I miss this so much." Helen stopped what she was doing and looked at her daughter. "Me too, my daughter, me too." Or the day Julia came home from school, crying because some girls had made fun of her background. Beatrice was about to call the principal furious when Helen stopped her. "Let me handle this," she said. And then she took Julia to her room, sat with her, and told her stories about Robert himself, who had grown up poor on the outskirts of New York before building his empire. "Your grandfather always said it doesn't matter where you come from, but where you're going," Helen told her granddaughter. "And you, my dear, are going to incredible places." Julia hugged her grandmother in that moment, and Helen felt her heart fill with a love she didn't know she was still capable of feeling. The months turned into a year, and then 2. The house that was once silent and empty was now full of life. Julia thrived in school, her excellent grades reflecting her dedication. Beatrice had found a new purpose, volunteering at an organization that helped homeless women, using her own experience to make a difference. And Helen, who had once lived only for business, rediscovered what it meant to have a family. She and Beatrice still had their difficult moments, arguments about the past or disagreements about the present. But they always found their way back to each other, always remembered the promise of honesty and family priority they had made. Michael became not just an uncle, but a father figure to Julia. He taught her to drive when she turned 18, was present at every school performance and became her biggest supporter. The Montgomery family was rebuilding itself, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, moment by moment. And although the scars of the past would never completely fade, they were learning that it was possible to carry those marks and still move forward together. The 3rd year since their reunion brought profound changes for all the Montgomerys. The Upper East Side house, which once seemed too large even for echoes, now pulsed with an energy Helen never imagined she would experience again. Julia was 14, about to turn 15, and had transformed into a confident and articulate young woman, a world away from the frightened girl who had appeared in the restaurant that Saturday afternoon. It was a Sunday morning when Helen woke to the sound of laughter coming from the garden. She rose slowly, put on her silk robe and went to the window. Down. Below, Beatrice and Julia were playing a makeshift game of volleyball, using a net Michael had installed the previous weekend. The two were barefoot on the grass, their hair loose in the wind, completely absorbed in the game. Helen watched the scene with a warm heart. Beatrice had gained a healthy weight, her face had regained its vibrancy, and she laughed with a freedom Helen hadn't seen in decades. Her daughter had faced a long road to recovery, endless therapy sessions, moments of relapse and victory. But there she was, strong and present, being the mother Julia had always deserved. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Helen went downstairs and found one of the housekeepers opening the door for Michael, who arrived carrying boxes of still warm bagels. "Good morning, Mum," he greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. "I brought breakfast." "You spoil us, Michael," Helen smiled. "Someone has to," he replied with a wink. They headed to the kitchen, where the table was already set. Beatrice and Julia came in shortly after, their cheeks flushed from the exercise. "Uncle Michael," Julia ran to hug him. "You came." "Of course I did," he replied, opening the boxes. It's Sunday, the sacred day of family breakfast. This routine had established itself naturally over the years. Every Sunday, without exception, the 4 of them gathered for breakfast. It was a time for conversation, for planning the week, for simply being together. Helen valued these gatherings more than any business meeting she had ever attended. As they ate, Julia announced, "I've been thinking about my 15th birthday." Beatrice smiled. "Already, honey? It's still a few months away." "I know, but I want to do something different," Julia explained, her eyes shining. "I don't want a huge party with people I barely know. I want something more meaningful." Helen leaned forward, interested. "What do you have in mind, dear?" Julia hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I'd like to invite some of the kids from the old community where Mom and I lived. Some of them are still there going through the same hardships I did. I want them to be able to come here, to see that there's another path possible." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Beatrice brought a hand to her lips, her eyes welling up. Michael cleared his throat, clearly touched, and Helen felt an immense pride flood her chest. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Helen said finally, "but we won't just throw a party, we'll do something that really makes a difference." And so the project was born that would change not only Julia's party, but also the future of the Montgomery family. Helen proposed the creation of a foundation dedicated to helping children and families in vulnerable situations. It would be more than occasional charity, it would be a long-term commitment to education, housing, and opportunity. In the following months, as preparations for Julia's birthday moved forward, the Julia Montgomery Foundation began to take shape. Helen used her business experience to structure the organization, Michael handled the legal and financial aspects, and Beatrice, with her personal experience, helped design the assistance programs. Julia was involved in everything, even while keeping up with her school responsibilities. She visited communities, talked with families, and helped identify the most urgent needs. Seeing her granddaughter so young, demonstrating so much empathy and commitment, made Helen reflect on the legacy that truly mattered. One afternoon, Helen was in her office reviewing documents for the foundation when Beatrice appeared at the door. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course, my daughter." Helen gestured to the chair in front of her desk. Beatrice sat down and was silent for a few seconds, as if choosing the right words. "I wanted to thank you, Mom." "Thank me?" Helen seemed surprised. "For what?" "For everything," Beatrice said simply. "For not giving up on me. For welcoming Julia. For giving us not just a house, but a real family." Helen felt emotion tighten her throat. "You are my daughter, Beatrice. I could never give up on you." "I know it wasn't easy," Beatrice continued. "I know there are days when you still feel angry at me for being away so long. I see it in your eyes even when you don't say anything." Helen didn't deny it. It would have been a lie. There were days, especially when she saw Julia laughing with Beatrice, that she wondered how many moments like that she had missed. How many birthdays, how many firsts, how many hugs she could have had with her daughter if Beatrice had trusted her from the start. "You're right," Helen admitted. "There are days when it still hurts. But the truth is the anger fades and what remains is gratitude. Gratitude for having you back, for knowing my granddaughter, for having a second chance to be the mother and grandmother I should have been all along." The two stood up at the same time and embraced. It was a long, tight hug that said everything words couldn't express. When they separated, Beatrice wiped her tears and smiled. "Julia is so excited about the party." "I am too," Helen admitted. "It's going to be a special day." And it was. The day of Julia's 15th birthday dawned sunny and clear. The mansion had been decorated in an elegant yet welcoming theme, with flowers everywhere and a large tent set up in the garden. But what made this party unique wasn't the decor or the exquisite food. It was the guests. In addition to some of Julia's schoolmates and family friends, there were 15 children from the old community, where she and Beatrice had lived. They arrived accompanied by their mothers, all visibly nervous and impressed by the place. Helen greeted them personally at the door, making sure they felt welcome. Julia was radiant in her light pink dress, simple but elegant, chosen by herself. She greeted each child by name, hugged each one, and personally led them to see the garden, the pool, the house. Michael organized activities for all the children, from pool games to an arts and crafts workshop. He had hired professional monitors, but made a point of participating in everything, playing with the children as if he were one of them. Beatrice circulated among the mothers, talking, offering support, listening to their stories. She knew exactly what these women were facing, because she had been in their shoes. And now, for the first time, she felt she could do something concrete to help. When it was time for dinner, everyone gathered under the tent. The tables were arranged in a U-shape, ensuring everyone could see each other. Helen asked for silence and stood up to make a speech. "Dear friends and family," she began, her voice firm but emotional. Today, we celebrate not only my granddaughter Julia's 15th birthday, but also the rebirth of our family. 3 years ago, a brave little girl walked into a restaurant and changed our lives forever. She looked at Julia, who was sitting between Beatrice and one of the children from the community. With a simple gesture, pointing to a ring, she gave us back something we thought we had lost forever. She taught us that courage can come in any size, that love is stronger than fear, and that family is not just about blood, but about choices. Helen paused, feeling tears threaten to fall. That is why we decided to create the Julia Montgomery Foundation, to honor that lesson. We want to help other children and families find their way, just as Julia found hers and, in doing so, found us. Applause echoed through the tent. Helen nodded to Michael, who brought over a blue velvet box. She opened, it revealing a delicate ring with an emerald smaller than her own, but just as brilliant, surrounded by tiny diamonds. On the sides of the ring, Julia's initials were engraved in gold. "This ring," Helen said, carefully taking the jewel, "is a symbol of our family. Just like the ring your grandmother had that your mother kept for all those years, this one is now yours. It represents the past that brought us here, the present we share, and the future we will build together." She approached Julia and placed the ring on her finger. The girl looked at the jewel, then at her grandmother, and her eyes filled with tears. It was then that something no one expected happened. Julia stood up, hugged Helen tightly, and for the first time since they had met, said aloud for everyone to hear, "Thank you, Grandma." The word echoed in the emotional silence. Grandma. Not Mrs. Montgomery, not Helen, but Grandma. Helen felt her legs weaken and had to hold on to Julia to keep from falling. Beatrice brought her hands to her face, crying openly. Michael wiped his eyes, not bothering to hide his emotion. The children from the community watched, with wide eyes, witnessing something that transcended any social or economic difference. They were seeing pure love, genuine connection, family in its truest sense. The rest of the party was a celebration of joy. The children danced, played, and ate until they couldn't anymore. The mothers talked with Beatrice and Helen about the foundation, about the opportunities that would be available for their families. Michael announced that the foundation would offer full scholarships, professional training programs for parents, and basic medical assistance. As night fell and the guests began to leave, each child took home a special gift chosen by Julia, along with a formal invitation to participate in the foundation's programs. The mothers left with hope in their eyes, something many of them hadn't felt in a long time. After the last guest had departed, the 4 Montgomerys sat in the garden, exhausted but happy. Julia still wore the ring, occasionally turning it on her finger to watch the emerald catch the starlight. "It was a perfect day," she said softly. "It was," Beatrice agreed, putting an arm around her daughter's shoulders. Michael stretched his legs and sighed contentedly. "Those kids will never forget today." Helen watched the 3. Of them, her heart so full it felt like it would overflow. "Neither will we," she said, "and this is just the beginning." And she was right. In the months that followed, the Julia Montgomery Foundation grew rapidly. What began as a family project transformed into a respected organization, with partnerships with schools, hospitals, and other institutions. Beatrice took on a leadership role, using her story to inspire other women. Michael ensured the foundation had the necessary financial structure for long-term sustainability. And Julia, even with her school commitments, dedicated all her free time to the foundation. She visited the assisted families, monitored the progress of the children in the scholarship program, and became an increasingly vocal advocate for the rights of vulnerable children. A year after her 15th birthday party, Julia graduated from high school with honors. Several prestigious universities offered her admission, but she already knew what she wanted to do. During the graduation ceremony, when called to the stage to receive her diploma, she announced her decision. "I am going to major in social work," she told the audience, "and I will work at the Julia Montgomery Foundation, helping other children find the path that I found." The decision surprised no one who knew Julia. She had found her purpose, her calling. And unlike many young people her age, She was absolutely certain of what she wanted to do with her life. That night, during the family dinner that had become a sacred tradition, Julia reflected aloud. "You know," she said, pushing food around her plate with her fork, "I keep thinking how different everything could have been if I hadn't noticed Grandma's ring that day." Beatrice, who was pouring water, stopped and looked at her daughter. "But you did notice, my love, and that changed everything." "It wasn't just the ring," Helen added, her voice filled with accumulated wisdom. "The ring was just a detail. What really made the difference was your courage to speak up, to ask for help. It was my decision to listen, to believe. It was our collective willingness to forgive, to start over, to choose love over fear and pain." Michael nodded. "Fate may have pushed us in the right direction, but the rest was a choice. Our choice to be a real family." Julia smiled, looking at each of them. The ring on her finger caught the light of the candles in the center of the table, shining like a promise. She touched it delicately, remembering the journey that small jewel represented. "Then we chose well," she said finally. And they all agreed in silence, each lost in their own reflections on the path they had traveled and the future they were still building together. 5 years had passed since that fateful afternoon at the Four Seasons. Julia was now 20, a junior studying social work at NYU and working part-time at the Julia Montgomery Foundation, which had become a national benchmark for programs assisting vulnerable children and families. Helen had turned 78, still sharp and active, dividing her time between the foundation and rare commitments at the construction company, now managed almost entirely by a professional team. Michael, at 50, had found a balance between work and personal life, dedicating more time to his family than he had ever thought possible. And Beatrice, transformed and renewed, was the soul of the foundation, touching lives with her story of resilience. It was a Thursday evening when they all gathered in the mansion's dining room. The tradition of family dinners had evolved from Sundays to at least 3 times a week, whenever their schedules allowed. The table was set with simple elegance, fresh flowers in the center and lit candles creating a warm atmosphere. Helen watched everyone around her as she savored the risotto the cook had prepared, her heart filled with a gratitude so deep it sometimes ached. To look at this scene at her family gathered, laughing and talking, still felt like a dream from which she feared waking. "Grandma," Julia got her attention. "Are you okay? You're so quiet." Helen smiled. "I'm wonderful, dear. Just thinking about how blessed we are." Beatrice reached out and touched Helen's hand. "We are, Mum. Every single day I'm thankful for that moment in the restaurant." Michael poured himself more wine. "I was thinking today," he began, "about that day. Do you remember how I wanted security to get Julia out of there? I almost ruined everything." "You were being protective," Helen defended him. "You can't blame yourself for that." "But Mom saw beyond that," Michael insisted. "You saw what I couldn't see. A child needing help, a chance to reclaim something we thought was lost forever." Julia, who was fiddling with the ring she never took off, joined the conversation. "I remember being terrified. I was sure I was going to be thrown out of that restaurant. But when I looked into Grandma's eyes, I saw something that made me stay. I saw kindness." "It wasn't kindness," Helen corrected gently. "It was recognition. Even without knowing who you were yet, some part of me recognized you. It recognized family." The conversation flowed naturally, as it always did at these dinners. They talked about the foundation's new projects, about the 20 families who had benefited in the last month, about Julia's graduation in a year. They talked about Michael's plans to marry Laura, his girlfriend of 3 years, a dedicated lawyer who had fallen in love not just with him, but with the entire Montgomery family. After dinner, as had become their custom, they moved to the living room. Helen sat in her favorite armchair, the same one where Robert used to sit to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings. Julia settled on the floor, leaning against her grandmother's legs. Beatrice and Michael took the sofa. "Mum," Beatrice began, her voice carrying a weight of seriousness that caught everyone's attention. "I need to say something I've been holding on to for a while." Helen felt a pang of concern. "What is it, my daughter?" Beatrice took a deep breath. "I need to apologize, truly. For all the choices I made, for all the years I stole from you, from us. I know I've said it before, but I feel I've never fully expressed how much I regret it." "B," Michael started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish, please," she asked. "For a long time I convinced myself I had done the right thing. That disappearing was protecting you. But the truth is, I was a coward. Dad offered help, offered protection, and yet I chose to run. I chose loneliness instead of trusting my family, and because of that you spent 13 years suffering, Mum. Michael grew up without his older sister. Julia was born and raised in poverty when she could have had a completely different life." Tears were now streaming freely down Beatrice's face, and the worst part is that Dad passed away knowing where I was, carrying that secret alone. He died protecting my selfish choice, and I wasn't even there to say goodbye. The silence that followed was heavy. Julia turned to look at her mother, her own eyes moist. Helen felt her heart ache with the raw pain in her daughter's voice. It was Helen who spoke first. "Beatrice, look at me." Beatrice looked up, her face stained with tears. "You were scared," Helen said firmly. "You were 27 and being threatened by dangerous men. Your father, my husband, the person you trusted most in the world, told you the only way to keep the family safe was for you to disappear. How can you blame yourself for trusting him?" "But I could have come back later," Beatrice protested, "when Dad passed away, when the danger was gone." "And where were you?" Helen asked. "You were alone in a strange city, working menial jobs, trying to survive. You were pregnant with Julia, or raising her by yourself, and carrying the weight of a lie that had lasted for years. How could you just come back and explain all that?" Michael leaned forward. "B, you need to stop punishing yourself. Yes, they were lost years. Yes, we all suffered. But look where we are now. Look what we've built together." He gestured around the room, but the meaning was broader. The foundation, the lives they had changed, the family they had rebuilt. None of this would exist if you hadn't gone through all that. Your experience, your suffering, it's been transformed into something bigger than any of us. Julia stood up and went to her mother, hugging her tightly. "Mom, you did the best you could. You raised me alone, you fed me, you taught me to be strong. When you got sick, when things got hard, you never completely gave up. And when you saw the opportunity to give me a better life, even if it meant revealing your entire past, you took it. That's not cowardice, that's love." Beatrice held her daughter, sobbing. "I just wish you'd had more from the beginning." "But I had enough," Julia said firmly. "I had you. I had your love. And now I have a whole family that loves me. I wouldn't change a thing, Mum, because everything brought me here." Helen stood and joined the hug, wrapping her daughter and granddaughter in her arms. Michael was quick to join in, and the four of them stood there intertwined, crying and healing wounds they didn't even know were still open. When they finally separated, all with stained faces and red eyes, there was a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before. As if something that needed to be said had finally been expressed, something that needed to heal had finally been touched. Helen returned to her armchair and got a box of tissues, passing them around. After everyone had settled again, she began to speak. "You know," she said, her voice calm but full of emotion, "when Robert passed, I thought my life was over. We had lost Beatrice just 2 years before, and then I lost my husband. Michael was absorbed in the business, trying to fill the void his father had left. And I was alone in this enormous house, surrounded by memories but with no one to share them with." She paused, her eyes distant. "I became just the matriarch of the Montgomerys, the businesswoman, the respected widow, the social philanthropist, but I wasn't an active mother. I wasn't a grandmother. I was just an old woman living in a house that was too big, waiting for time to pass." "Mom," Michael began, but Helen continued, "And then this girl appeared." She looked at Julia with so much love it made everyone's heart ache. This brave girl who had nothing but who saw a ring and decided to take a chance, who had the audacity to believe that a rich old lady in an expensive restaurant could care about her. And she didn't just change her own life, she changed all of our lives. Julia lowered her eyes, her cheeks blushing. "I just did what I had to do." "Exactly," Helen said. "You did what you had to do, even though you were scared. Just like your mother did what she thought she had to do, even though she was scared. Just Like I did what I had to do when I decided to follow you to that apartment, even without knowing what I would find. Fear didn't stop us, and that's what makes us a family." Beatrice wiped away the last of her tears. "The foundation was the best thing we ever did." "It was Julia's idea," Michael reminded them. "But it was Grandma who made it possible," Julia replied. "It was Uncle Michael who made sure we had the structure. It was Mom who gave it a soul. It was all of us working together," Helen nodded. "And look we've achieved. In 5 years, we've helped over 200 families. We've provided scholarships for 50 children. We've empowered 30 women for the workforce. And every one of those numbers is a real life, a real story, a real family that is better off because of what we did together." "There's something I never told you," Julia said suddenly. "About that day in the restaurant." They all turned to her, curious. "When I saw Grandma's ring," she continued, "I almost didn't say anything. I thought it would be ridiculous, that no one would believe me. But then I looked at my life, at the empty apartment where my mom hadn't been for days, at the future that seemed not to exist, and I thought that if I didn't try, if I didn't take the risk, I would never know if it could have been different." She turned the ring on her finger. "This ring here, it reminds me every day of that choice. It reminds me that sometimes the only difference between one life and another is the courage to take a step, to speak up, to believe it can be better." Julia's words echoed in the room. Helen looked at her own ring, the one she had worn for so many years, which had survived so many changes, which had been the catalyst for everything. Robert had had those rings made as a symbol of love and family commitment. He could never have imagined that one day, years after he was gone, that symbol would be what brought his family back together. Michael broke the thoughtful silence. "You know what I think Dad would say if he could see us now?" "What?" Beatrice asked. "He'd say he was right about the rings," Michael smiled. "He always said they were. Symbols of protection and connection. And that's exactly what they were. The ring protected Beatrice while she was away, reminding her of who she was. The ring connected Julia to us when she needed it most. And the rings keep us together now, reminding us of where we came from and where we're going." Helen smiled through her tears. "Your father was a wise man." "He was," Beatrice agreed, "and he loved this family more than anything. I bet wherever he is, he's happy to see that we finally understand what he always knew, that family is everything." The evening wore on with more conversation, more memories, more plans for the future. They talked about expanding the foundation to other cities, about Michael's wedding the following summer, about Julia's studies, and her dreams of one day running the foundation herself. When they finally decided to call it a night, it was well past midnight. Michael had to leave for an early meeting the next morning. Before he left, he hugged each of them for a long moment. After he was gone, Beatrice and Julia also retired to their rooms. Helen remained alone in the living room for a few minutes, enjoying the silence that was now comfortable rather than lonely. She looked around the house, at the picture frames that now included recent photos, at the details that showed this house was lived in, loved, filled. Before heading up to her room, Helen stopped in front of a large picture frame on the hallway wall. It was the photo from Julia's 15th birthday party, the exact moment she had placed the ring on her granddaughter's finger. The photographer had perfectly captured the emotion on everyone's faces, the love, the gratitude, the connection. "Thank you," Helen whispered, not quite sure if she was speaking to Robert, to fate, or simply to life itself. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Upstairs, Beatrice was in Julia's room, sitting together on the bed, as they often did before sleep. "Are you okay, Mom?" Julia asked. That conversation was intense. "I'm okay," Beatrice answered. "In fact, I'm better than I've been in years. I think I needed to say all that out loud, needed to hear your responses." "Grandma's right, you know," Julia said. "You did the best you could." "I know that now," Beatrice smiled. "And look where we've ended up." They sat, in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. "Mom," Julia said finally, "do you regret anything?" Beatrice thought carefully before answering. "I regret the suffering we caused each other. I regret the lost years, but I don't regret you. Ever. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and if everything I went through was necessary to have you, then it was worth it. Julia hugged her mother. I love you, Mom. I love you too, my daughter, more than words can say. When Beatrice finally went to her own room, she passed Helen's door and noticed. The light was still on. She knocked softly. Come in, came the reply. Beatrice opened the door to find Helen sitting on the bed, flipping through an old photo album. Can't sleep? Beatrice asked. Just reliving some memories, Helen smiled. Sit with me. Beatrice joined her mother on the bed, and together they looked at the old photos. A young Robert, Helen with Beatrice and Michael as children, birthdays, Christmases, moments from a life that seemed to have been lived by entirely different people. We were so young, Helen murmured. We thought we had all the time in the world. Beatrice touched a photo of herself at about 10 years old, smiling with her front teeth missing. I was happy and I didn't even know it. We all were, Helen agreed. But you know something, my daughter. I think we're happier now. Beatrice looked at her mother, surprised. Even with everything we lost? Especially because of everything we lost, Helen said, because now we know the value. We know that every family dinner is precious. Every laugh from Julia is a gift. Every hug from you is a miracle. Before we took it all for granted, now we cherish every moment. They stayed there for another hour, talking, remembering, healing. When Beatrice finally said goodnight and went to her room, they both felt that something fundamental had shifted, that finally, truly, they had forgiven each other, and more importantly, they had found each other again not as a mother and daughter separated by years of pain, but as two women who shared a history, a love, and a future. The next morning, life continued its normal routine. Julia went to the university, Beatrice to the foundation, and Helen to a meeting about expanding their assistance programs. But there was something different in the air, a lightness that hadn't been there before, and as each of them went about their day, they carried with them the certainty that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as a family, as it always should have been. The story of the Montgomery family, which began with a painful disappearance which was reignited through the brave gesture of a young girl and the symbol of a ring, had transformed into something greater than any of them could have imagined. It had become a legacy of love, forgiveness, new beginnings, and hope. And that legacy would continue, passed down from generation to generation, just like the rings that symbolized not just wealth or status, but the unbreakable bond of a family that had learned, the hardest way possible, that true love always finds its way back home. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Helen, Beatrice, and Julia has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of reunion, forgiveness, and family reconstruction, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment touched you the most. Was it Julia's courage in asking for help, Beatrice's sacrifice to protect her family, or perhaps Helen's unconditional love that never gave up? Every day we bring intense and true stories like this one, revealing the deepest and most emotional side of the human soul, showing that no matter how difficult the situation, there is always hope for a new beginning. Your participation in the comments inspires us to continue creating these narratives that celebrate the strength of family love. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you believe in the transformative power of family ties.